Recently, I have been having a blast with multicolor FDM printing, from D&D props to terrain and even miniatures. But given the focus of my channel, many people have been asking me to try these new printers specifically for multi-material supports on minis. So today we'll be taking a look at just that, and I'll be seeing whether multi-material supports are something I would deem viable for printing better miniatures on FDM machines. By now you've probably seen me printing multicolor terrain here on the channel, so while that printer is busy churning out another set of dungeon blocks, today we'll be running our support tests on a different machine. For this project I'm using Bambu Lab's new X2D, which they sent over after I mentioned I wanted to test multi-material supports. The reason the X2D specifically is interesting for this project is that it sports two nozzles in one printhead that it can quickly swap between without having to constantly purge like a traditional AMS style printer, allowing us to have a different colour or different material in each nozzle. The primary nozzle uses a direct drive extruder, while the secondary uses a Bowden setup. In practice, this just means that the secondary nozzle isn't really intended for high detail or high speed printing. It's there to handle support material, which makes it a good fit for the sort of projects we're doing today. Just to be clear, while Bambu Lab did provide the X2D for this project today, this is not a sponsored video or a review. This is a project I was already planning on doing, they just hoped to bring that project forward a bit by providing a printer that could do the job. If you are looking for a more in-depth look at the X2D, I'll leave some links down below to a review by Fohammer. I think that their video really hits the nail on the head as to what this printer is and who it's for, and they cover it far more thoroughly in that video than I will be here today. Because today I'm really just here to answer that one question. Do multi-material supports actually make for better FDM miniatures? Until this project, I have only ever printed with various types of PLA filament, so printing with PETG and this specifically made support material will be a new experience for me. But even just testing out some simple support interfaces with fully default settings made me quite hopeful for this project. PLA supports need to be some distance from your model to support overhangs without fusing to them. Using something like a matte PLA, you can ever so slightly close that gap, but needing to leave any space at all, you will always have less than perfect overhangs. On the other hand, using PETG or the support filament, we can have our PLA part print directly on that support interface, no gap needed, which, at least in my testing, meant that these overhangs printed almost as clean as the top surface of the print, and it didn't really increase the print times too drastically on these parts. And the PETG quite literally just fell off as soon as the part had cooled, which was great for this model, but did raise a couple of concerns about printing miniatures, making me question that once we get so far through a print, would PETG just fail to support floating regions? But alas, we can't know without testing, so it's time to jump into the slicer and set off some prints. First and foremost, some pure single material prints, both the mini and the supports printed in basic PLA with my usual support setup, including that gap between the supports and our model. As expected, these came away from the mini easy enough, supported all the overhangs pretty well, and ensured that all of those islands were held in place until they connected to the main model. And once the supports were removed, we were left with exactly what I have come to expect. Perfectly usable prints, but all of the usual FDM suspects. Sagging underneath islands, a little fringing on sheer overhangs, and rougher undersides than I would like. A totally fine print, 100% usable, and it looks good, just not perfect. And this is what I've come to expect from FDM printed miniatures that need supports. But the big question today, can we improve this? The first big issue I noticed was print times. As soon as I flicked on multi-material supports, these print times shot through the roof. What would have been a 2-hour print in pure PLA became 13 hours, with 11 of those being the prime tower alone. Now, a prime tower is unavoidable. Whenever we swap back to another nozzle, toolhead, or material on any multi-material printer, it will need to push some amount of filament through the nozzle, just to make sure it's flowing correctly and with the right amount of pressure. And on a model like this, where the support material is required almost every layer, that time adds up. So I started doing some research, changing settings to allow the filament to print quicker and decreasing the amount of material that would be printed on that prime tower, eventually getting this print down to a more manageable 7-ish hours. At this stage, looking over the model, I noticed that so little of the Mini was actually utilizing the multi-material support interfaces, and it appeared that a lot of the model was still being held up by PLA, which with these support settings I was worried would mean those PLA areas would fuse with the Mini. And swapping the supports over to print entirely with that dedicated support material increased the print time by a whole 4 minutes. So I figured, why not? Sure, the slicer threw up a warning, but I assumed that this was to help reduce print times and save on our more expensive support materials. This was a mistake. That's something I won't figure out for a few more prints, so bear with me while I dial my filament in, and then realize it was a bad idea, and that I do in fact not know better than the slicer. These initial prints might not look pretty, and taking a look at these supports filled with holes, blobs, and riddled with stringing, it was quite clear that I had overestimated how fast I could print these materials on that secondary Bowden nozzle. That said, the prints did manage to finish, so let's take a look. Both the PETG and support material separated from the model itself with relative ease. The biggest issue for both was that the materials themselves are rather sturdy, especially the PETG, which made it really hard to pull the supports away. And in areas where the supports were wrapped around the model or printed between parts, forget about getting those out cleanly. In hindsight, this should have been my first indication not to print the entire support structure in these materials, but you know. Overall, I would say that the support material was nicer to remove than the PETG. It definitely felt more familiar, like removing PLA from a model, rather than some industrial level plastic that refused to be cut. But before making any final judgments, I definitely needed to dial these materials in better. And at this point, I also decided to swap over to testing everything on a single model, just so that it was easier to compare. And so, the testing began. My first instinct was to stick with the PETG, at least for now. It's a more documented material, which should ideally make it easier to dial in. First, I bumped the prime volume back up closer to the defaults, thinking that maybe I'd been a little too aggressive trying to get those print times down. That really didn't help. The supports still looked rough, and this time I wasn't lucky enough to make it to the end of a print before they started failing, so I went the other direction. I slowed the PETG down, backed the flow closer to the defaults, and honestly it looked almost identical. And after several more attempts, it became pretty clear that I was just going in circles at this point. Eventually, I caved and ran the PETG exactly as Bambu recommended on a test piece. Huge prime tower, painfully slow print speeds, all the default settings. The support trunks definitely looked cleaner, but the actual support interface still looked bad and under-extruded with the 0.2mm nozzle, and once the print finished, it really didn't look any better than the PLA supports I'd started with. At this point, I was certainly starting to wonder whether the problem was even my settings at all. Remember how I mentioned that the secondary nozzle uses a Bowden feed? Well, I'm starting to think that maybe asking it to print PETG through a 0.2mm nozzle just is not playing to its strengths. So rather than spending another couple of days chasing settings that just weren't getting me anywhere, I decided to park the PETG for now and move on to that dedicated support filament instead. And almost immediately, things started to look a lot more promising. Meeting somewhere in the middle between my original settings and the defaults, I finally had a print where the supports actually looked good, and more importantly, one that finished successfully. There was just one catch. At almost 11 hours for a miniature of this size, this print was painfully slow. And even then, the results weren't perfect. Some islands still hadn't bonded to the support interface properly, and anywhere the supports needed to start directly on the model simply hadn't printed. But before I can look too hard at the quality of these prints, first and foremost I'm back to chasing those print times. Eventually, I got this print down to around 8.5 hours, and the way that I went about doing this was actually raising my maximum volumetric speed back up to what it was on those failed prints, because even on those, my prime tower was still printing perfectly fine and doing its job. And then I just came in and used the actual support speeds to limit the flow on the model itself, back down to a value that was working, somewhere just below 1mm. And the supports looked almost identical to that slower 11-hour print. Except that now, nothing was sticking to them. At first, I simply assumed that I'd pushed the support material too hard, that maybe the faster interface just wasn't extruding cleanly or the material wasn't adhering to itself. But then it hit me. Maybe, just maybe, I should stop trying to outsmart the slicer. Instead of printing the entire support structure with the secondary material, what if we just use it for the interface, like the slicer had wanted me to from the very beginning? What? Oh, it worked. Nearly identical print time, maybe even a little bit faster, and everything was there. My only assumption is that the little bits of PLA support are either helping to hold the model, or the thin layer or two of support interfaces slightly mixing with that PLA underneath, giving it a tiny bit more hold. Either way, this was so much better. Support removal was still great, easy to separate from the Mini, and actually being able to cut away the PLA support trunks made the whole process of removal much less frustrating. So, out of curiosity, I went back and repeated this print with PETG, using the same approach, and the results were very similar. The PETG worked so much better in this application, though I do still think that that dedicated support filament was a little easier to remove and possibly still produced slightly better contact surfaces. So after way too much trial and error, we can finally compare some PLA supports against multi-material interfaces. The difference is minor. Those obvious drooping areas on the islands and the fringing on the sword are almost completely gone. Even if the overhangs aren't 100%, they're certainly better. If I had to put a number on it, I would say that these multi-material supports have taken our PLA miniature from 85% of the way there to probably closer to 95%, a slight increase in quality that certainly does capture more detail and removes some of the less than pretty parts of an FDM Mini. So to answer our first question, yes, multi-material supports can make FDM printed miniatures better. Does it take a little more to dial in? Yeah. Is it a little more finicky and prone to failure? Also yes. But if you are looking for that 10% increase in quality, here it is. I can't deny that. But with these prints taking 2 to 3 times as long, we come back to that other question. Is this actually viable for our FDM Minis? And that was a little harder to answer. Maybe if I was printing player minis for D&D, epic villains, or hero or character models for wargaming, then this slight bump in quality would be worth that increased print time. Or if you're someone who only sits down occasionally to paint up a couple models at a time where those print times won't worry you, then yeah, this is great. But for printing up a horde of monsters, bulk infantry, or minis that will only get used a handful of times, maybe 85% is still good enough. FDM Minis will never be perfect, but with cool new developments in FDM printing, it becomes easy to get sucked up in the idea that they could be. And if that is a part of the hobby that you enjoy, pushing FDM printers to the absolute limit, by all means go for it. I'm not going to stop you. And I will certainly be keeping multi-material supports in my back pocket for those more heroic miniatures. But for the vast majority of my prints, where I just want to be able to reliably pull minis off the printer and paint them up to use on the game table, I think that PLA supports are going to work just fine. Do be sure to like if you liked, and subscribe for more FDM printing and tabletop projects. But most importantly, thank you so much for watching. And as always, have a good one.